Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to thank you for being with us tonight. We have a very timely and important discussion, and glad to have you a part of it. If you haven't already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. However, as always, we encourage you to tweet after our speakers' remarks, and we also invite you to like the World Affairs Council on Facebook if you haven't already done so. We are starting to wind down our busy season, but the Council still has some exciting events planned for the rest of this year. And of course, we've already started planning for 2016. A couple quick notices coming up. On Tuesday, November 17th, we will be hosting Ted Koppel, the former ABC News icon, as he comes to warn about the potential for cyber attacks on America, a subject that has become a passion for him of late. On Monday, November 23rd, we're going to be holding a noontime program with the Pew Research Center to discuss global attitudes towards the United States. I think that should be really interesting to see the research results that Pew has developed about opinions on America around the world. Guests are welcome to bring lunch and join in on that conversation. We want it to be participatory as well. Coming early in 2016, on Monday, January 25th, is the author Robert Boynton, who will delve into the topic of his new book, a topic we really don't hear that much about, which is North Korean kidnappings of Japanese citizens in the 1970s and 80s, a fascinating sort of historical study that I think has implications for the present as well. These events, all of them, and the Council's citizen diplomacy tours, which I know there are a number of our travelers with us tonight, along with the support of all of our members and corporate partners, enable the Council to offer its most important programs, which are our educational efforts with a diverse group of over 2,200 middle and high school students in 90 schools throughout the Philadelphia area, seeking to foster the skills and sensibilities that students will need in order to compete and to thrive in our global and knowledge-based world. Now for tonight's program. The 2016 presidential election cycle is obviously well underway. We've had a few Republican primary debates. Last week we saw the first Democratic debate of the season. Discussions around the candidates, already fiery, is heating up as we move towards the casting of the first votes. Here with us tonight to discuss his views on the upcoming election cycle, and particularly the campaign of Secretary Hillary Clinton, is political insider and author David Brock, whose boldly titled new book, Killing the Messenger, The Right-Wing Plot to Derail Hillary and Hijack Your Government, will form the basis of our discussion. A self-described one-time right-wing provocateur, Mr. Brock is now a defender of progressive causes and a supporter of Secretary Clinton. In the early 2000s, Mr. Brock founded Media Matters, saying that it is intended as a progressive media group dedicated to comprehensively monitoring, analyzing, and correcting conservative misinformation in the U.S. media. In his new book, our guest, with the acumen of a seasoned political player, takes us inside the Democratic war rooms and their 24/7 battles with the right for the control of storylines and messages that could influence the outcome of the 2016 election. Clearly, we were prophetic in scheduling this the night before Secretary Clinton's testimony before the Benghazi Committee, and hopefully we can talk about that as well. So please join me in welcoming Mr. David Brock.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Council for this opportunity. So I'm going to talk tonight about Killing the Messenger. What I started this book about a year ago, and I wanted to lay out the Republican playbook for the 2016 election, and that obviously covers a broad range of strategies and tactics and subjects. But since we were so prophetic and being on the eve of Secretary Clinton's testimony tomorrow on Benghazi, I've chosen for the prepared remarks to speak about the Benghazi scandal and its uses, and then we can get into anything on anybody's mind in the question section. 2 years ago, actually tomorrow, Media Matters published a book called The Benghazi Hoax, in which we exposed how Republicans twisted the facts, invented charges out of thin air, and dishonored the memory of 4 brave Americans who died in Benghazi in their attempt to turn a national tragedy into a political weapon. Last month, I published Killing the Messenger, whose subtitle is The Right-Wing Plot to Derail Hillary and Hijack Your Government. The centerpiece of this book is about the centerpiece of that plot, a partisan witch hunt that began with the despicable politicization of a terrorist attack on the United States and has since spiraled into a desperate fishing expedition and completely out of control effort to destroy Hillary Clinton at all costs. Tomorrow, Secretary Clinton will testify before the Benghazi Select Committee, as she's been asking to do for months. She's been called not because of the committee's concerns about diplomatic security, but about her emails. Clinton's use of a personal email account as Secretary of State followed the law and it followed precedent, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Benghazi, as the chairman of the committee has already admitted. But to Republicans, that doesn't matter. As I detail in Killing the Messenger, the Benghazi investigation was never about getting to the bottom of what actually happened. It was always a dirt-digging operation, a wild search for some hint of scandal that could stop Barack Obama from being reelected, and when that failed, stop Hillary Clinton from succeeding him. And in the days that followed my book's release, just in these past few weeks, Republicans started to finally admit it. House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy didn't just acknowledge the Benghazi hoax, he boasted about it. Quote, "Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right?" he crowed. "But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. Where are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping." The GOP's goal, McCarthy added in his mangled English, was to paint Clinton as untrustable. Then another Republican congressman, Richard Hanna, came forward and confessed the committee was, quote, "designed to go after Hillary." And last week, Republican officials told the New York Times that the committee began focusing on emails, not Benghazi, because the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, thought it was, quote, "a way to keep the issue alive and cause political problems for her campaign." Meanwhile, a whistleblower emerged from within the committee staff. A former investigator, Air Force Reserve officer, and self-described conservative Republican named Bradley Podliska. Major Podliska told CNN of the absurdity of life on the Benghazi committee. Staffers regularly wasted time online and sometimes drank on the job. Several joined a gun-buying club, whiling the hours away at the office, designing personalized weapons. Chrome-plated, monogram, Tiffany-style Glock 9mm, to be exact. He also reported that the committee trained its sights almost exclusively on Clinton following news reports on her emails, and he revealed that he had been fired for refusing to go along, which would make his firing unlawful. The committee responded by attacking Podliska as a, quote, "lousy employee" and divulging details of his employment, which is also against the law, in this case the Congressional Accountability Act, which prohibits the committee from making public details of an ongoing mediation surrounding Podliska's firing. Indeed, this response was just the kind of thing you'd expect from a political war room, which is exactly what this select committee has become. Over its 17 months in operation, longer than the investigations into the Kennedy assassination, the Iran-Contra scandal, or even Watergate, the committee has taken on a role as a taxpayer-funded arm of the Republican National Committee, spending $4.6 million of your money and careening from subject to subject in an attempt to manufacture scandal. Well, in that, they succeeded. As MSNBC's Steve Bannon wrote, the Benghazi Committee isn't investigating a scandal. The Benghazi Committee is the scandal. What's been discovered so far is an abuse of congressional power, leaking and lying to the press, and alleged violations of several laws and congressional rules. And the perpetrator is none other than the chairman of this sham investigation, Trey Gowdy. Now, if you want to know how we got here, you have to go back all the way to the 1970s. The Watergate scandal still sticks in Republicans' craw, and they've been trying to avenge it ever since. As many of you know, I once worked deep in the heart of the vast right-wing conspiracy when Bill Clinton rose to national prominence during the 1992 campaign. Funded by the billionaire Richard Mellon Scaife, we were determined to find the scandal that would bring down this dynamic young Democrat, or failing that, invent one. Conservatives managed to get a story written in the New York Times alleging that the Clintons had given improper favors to their investment partner in a failed land deal called Whitewater. The story didn't show any wrongdoing by the Clintons, and a CNN analysis later identified 19 separate errors of fact in it. But when Bill Clinton became president, Republicans saw it as an opportunity to even the score at one disgraced president per side. And hey, if they could take down his formidable wife at the same time, even better. Fact-finding wasn't the goal. Whitewater was about the journey, not the destination. An investigation would mean getting subpoena power to ask all manner of questions, request all manner of documents, spread innuendo, leak juicy factoids to friendly or gullible reporters, and then hold up those same stories as proof that the investigation needed to continue or even widen. That's how the Whitewater story gave birth to a highly politicized $70 million federal investigation of the Clintons, led by an overzealous prosecutor, Ken Starr. Along the way, Starr found plenty of excuses to continually expand his failed investigation until he could gin up spurious impeachment charges, which of course was the goal from the beginning. From day one, it was a search for a crime that could fit the punishment Republicans had already resolved to impose. More than a decade later came the night of September 11, 2012, and news of an attack on an American diplomatic facility in Libya. Note that there had been 64 attacks on American diplomatic targets overseas during the Bush administration, and Democrats hadn't used one of them to play politics. In fact, never before, dating back to Ronald Reagan, had a tragedy like this been fodder for a political attack from either party. But Mitt Romney's campaign was desperate. And so on the 11th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and well before all the facts were in regarding the unfolding events in Libya, Romney flat out accused President Obama of sympathizing with the terrorists. How disgraceful. And then the entire right-wing machine revved up to turn Benghazi into the magic bullet that would wreck the Obama administration. Indeed, there is an untold backstory to today's ill-conceived and unsavory GOP smear tactics. After the 2010 midterms, a shadowy organization called Groundswell, a sort of coordinating body for a whole host of right-wing groups, led by the Heritage Foundation's Ginny Thomas, yes, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, began secretly meeting. A recording of the group's deliberations, later published by Mother Jones, showed that after the Benghazi attack, they began agitating for a special congressional investigation. They formed the Benghazi Action Committee to push this agenda forward. On March 5, 2014, these activists signed a letter to John Boehner urging the appointment of a select committee, which the Speaker did on May 2nd. Among members of this BAC was Judicial Watch, a right-wing group that for years, going back to the 1990s, has engaged in a campaign of legal terrorism against the Clintons, bombarding them with frivolous lawsuits and document demands. Also in this coalition was a group called the Citizens Committee on Benghazi, a project of the longtime right-wing media watchdog group, Accuracy in Media. One of its board members was Wayne Simmons, who you may have seen on Fox News touting his 27 years of CIA experience to demand congressional action on Benghazi. Well, you won't be seeing Simmons anymore. Last week, he was arrested for fraud. Simmons never worked for the CIA. Speaking of Fox, the network was also an important driver of events, airing 1,098 evening segments on Benghazi in the first 20 months after the attacks. Senator John McCain proclaimed that Fox News Chairman Roger Ailes deserves credit for the Benghazi investigation, and Senator Lindsey Graham cheered, "Thank God for Fox." Never mind that by the spring of 2014, 6 congressional committees had released reports detailing the results of their exhaustive investigations. 2 other committees had also held hearings, and that fall, the Republican House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence would release its own report, making it the 9th congressional committee to investigate the attacks. And not one of them found any evidence to verify the far-flung theories of the far right. There was no stand-down order that prevented the saving of lives, no deliberate effort to mislead the public about the motive behind the attack, no muscle whistleblowers, no cover-up, nothing. More than 30 hearings, 200 witnesses, 11 published reports totaling 800 pages, and millions upon millions of taxpayer dollars. The recent estimate is $20 million overall, and the Republicans still had not found any wrongdoing. Now, in her prior congressional testimony back in January 2013, Hillary Clinton said she took responsibility for the events in Libya, she took immediate action to guard against such attacks in the future, and was transparent throughout, even releasing to the public the full report of the State Department's Accountability Review Board investigation. Even a Fox News commentator concluded that she hit the ball out of the park. Yet clearly it was time for yet another Benghazi investigation. Why? Well, from the moment she left the State Department, Republicans knew what Democrats also knew, that Clinton would be an almost unprecedentedly strong candidate, and as president would implement an ambitious progressive vision to move the country forward. So 3.5 years before Election Day, and with so much unknown about how the race would shape up, the Republicans knew one thing. They really, really didn't want to run against Hillary, so they moved to take her down. The right-wing billionaires Charles and David Koch, the Richard Mellon Scaife of our time, pledged to spend whatever it took from their bottomless treasure chest to defeat Hillary. One thing I'll say about the Kochs, they plan ahead. They groomed Trey Gowdy for his star turn, and they couldn't have found themselves a better pawn to serve as this generation's Ken Starr. Gowdy owes his political livelihood to the Koch brothers. 5 years ago, when an incumbent Republican congressman from South Carolina named Bob Inglis wandered off the reservation by acknowledging that climate change is a real threat, the Kochs backed Gowdy, then a county solicitor, to run against Inglis in a primary, helping him win a stunning upset victory. They've gotten their money's worth. In 2012, Gowdy was one of just 40 members of the House to receive a 100% score from the Koch's Americans for Prosperity, a perfect score he has maintained through this Congress as well. Gowdy backed measures to expand offshore oil drilling, including off the coast of South Carolina, a key Koch priority, and to this day, the Kochs remain his second largest career donor. So Gowdy was the ideal candidate to run this show trial and help achieve the Kochs' #1 goal, keeping Hillary Clinton out of the White House. That was his mission from day one, and it has elevated his reputation in Republican ranks. Conservative operative Bill Kristol recently declared Gowdy, quote, the most valuable Republican of the 2016 election cycle so far. In the last few weeks, Gowdy was floated as a candidate to move up to majority leader or even speaker. Donald Trump said he'd make Gowdy his attorney general. Lindsey Graham said he would be on the Supreme Court someday. There was even talk of Gowdy ending up on a presidential ticket, which is quite a rise from county solicitor in just 5 years. Now, initially, Chairman Gowdy pledged to run a nonpartisan fact-finding inquiry. He said, I have no friends to reward and no foes to punish. We're going to go wherever the facts take us. Unfortunately, we now know this was a lie. Before he was even appointed, and long before Kevin McCarthy let the cat out of the bag, Gowdy sat down for a little-noticed interview with none other than Ginny Thomas, a key player in the original effort to politicize Benghazi, published in the right-wing Daily Caller. In it, Gowdy prejudged the entire inquiry, stating flatly that he believed Hillary Clinton had committed unspecified crimes, and he was certain she was ready to perjure herself before Congress. In other words, the fix was in from the first bang of his gavel. For example, 6 months into the committee's work, Democratic ranking member Elijah Cummings wrote to Gowdy, Democrats were being wrongly excluded, pointing to at least 5 witness interviews that took place with no Democratic members or staff allowed to be present. Moreover, Cummings noted that Gowdy was consistently downplaying or outright hiding information gained from these secret interviews that might undermine his trumped-up case against Hillary. Gowdy has steadfastly refused to adopt committee rules that give the Democratic minority a voice in its proceedings or even a heads up about what the Republican members and staff are doing. In addition, Gowdy established a pattern of abusing his authority to issue subpoenas with no debate, without even a vote, dictating the course of the investigation himself with no input from the Democrats. Meanwhile, Gowdy consistently refused to provide full public transcripts of these secret interviews or even allow for a committee vote on whether they should be disclosed. Instead, he and his henchmen leaked cherry-picked excerpts from these interviews to skew the news. Committee leaks, in fact, were behind two blockbuster New York Times reports. One suggested that Hillary Clinton's use of a private email account may have violated federal law, and the other that a federal criminal investigation into her email practices was underway. Both of these stories were based on false information and had to be corrected or retracted. Yet both of them dominated the news cycle and set off fevered speculation about the imminent collapse of Hillary's presidential hopes. Earlier this month, Gowdy made a new accusation against Clinton, alleging that she had received the name of a CIA informant in an email from former Clinton aide Sidney Blumenthal. Quote, armed with that information, Gowdy charged, she forwarded that email to a colleague, debunking her claim that she never sent any classified information from her private email address. Gowdy made sure to underscore that the name of a human source is some of the most protected information in our intelligence community, the release of which could jeopardize not only national security, but human lives. He released a copy of the email with the name of the individual in question redacted, making it look even more like Hillary was sharing classified information from her private email account. Well, Gowdy got the headlines he wanted, such as Clinton burns CIA Libya contact. But he didn't get his facts straight. The CIA, which Gowdy hadn't bothered to ask about the email, slapped down his claim as false, saying that, in fact, the information in that email was not classified at all. It turns out Gowdy had doctored the document, inventing his own reasons for the redactions in order to defame Clinton. Gowdy's false claims were made in a communication to members of Congress. That makes him vulnerable to a referral to the Department of Justice for the criminal act of lying to Congress. By now, Trey Gowdy is very far away from his original mission. Indeed, last week, the New York Times reported that 8 months after Gowdy announced he planned to hold a dozen interviews with intelligence and national security officials, only one has been conducted. Gowdy has also proposed 11 public hearings about the attacks, and not one has taken place. Instead, in an effort to shift the focus from Benghazi to Hillary's email, the committee has demanded testimony from at least 18 former Clinton staffers, including 3 speechwriters and the IT guy who maintained Hillary's server. And last week, the Huffington Post noticed something else peculiar. The Benghazi Select Committee has held a total of 54 witness interviews, but Gowdy himself has showed up for fewer than 10. He skipped hearings featuring testimony from top intelligence officials. He was a no-show at hearings featuring survivors of the attacks, eyewitnesses to the events the committee was supposed to be investigating. In fact, the only times Gowdy bothered to show up were when those close to Clinton were testifying. One of Gowdy's very first subpoenas went to Sidney Blumenthal, who was grilled in a closed deposition for 9 hours. The committee has been pursuing a loony conspiracy theory that Blumenthal instigated the war in Libya and that he did it in order to profit. But it turns out that Gowdy was misrepresenting a humanitarian aid idea, an idea that was raised in the middle of the war, never came to pass, and no money ever changed hands. Secretary Clinton is expected to be quizzed on all this tomorrow, even though Blumenthal was asked and answered every question to him put about it. The committee also pursued a wholly out-of-bounds line of questioning about Blumenthal's political activities and relationships, having nothing to do with Benghazi. According to an account of the questions that Blumenthal was asked, made public by Democrats on the committee, he fielded more than 160 questions about his relationship and communications with the Clintons, more than 50 questions about the Clinton Foundation, where Blumenthal had been a consultant, more than 45 questions about the inner workings of the organizations that I run, for which Blumenthal works, and which have been sharply critical of the committee. Blumenthal was asked 0 questions about the U.S. presence and personnel in Benghazi. It's no wonder Gowdy refuses to release the transcript of his deposition. Just the other day, Gowdy, trying to deflect questions about the committee's partisanship, appeared on CBS's Face the Nation and claimed he wasn't interested in the Clinton Foundation at all, which obviously has nothing to do with Benghazi. Yet he asked Sidney Blumenthal more than 50 questions about it. Simply put, Gowdy was lying again. Unfortunately for Gowdy, the press is starting to wake up to these shenanigans. The New York Times ran an editorial 2 weeks ago declaring his committee, quote, an insult to the memory of 4 slain Americans and calling for it to be shut down. Yesterday on CNN, another committee member, Republican Lynn Westmoreland of Georgia, touted the emails of the ambassador in Libya who lost his life in the Benghazi attacks as a new revelation that the committee is going to release tomorrow. But the anchor, Chris Cuomo, pointed out that the emails were available to the Accountability Review Board 3 years ago. Westmoreland then impugned the integrity of that board, which was headed by 2 officials who had served Republican administrations in high posts. And so it goes. To be sure, there's no reason to keep this farce going. With Secretary Clinton scheduled tomorrow, however, it may be too late in the day for the committee to disband altogether. But if the public is to have any confidence in the committee's findings, Gowdy should resign his chairmanship immediately. Gowdy must go. Next, there ought to be an investigation into the Benghazi hoax itself, and Gowdy should spend his freed-up time as the star witness. For example, House rules prohibit the use of official resources for campaign or political purposes. If Gowdy used $4.6 million of taxpayer money to further the aims of the Republican National Committee, he is guilty of an extremely serious career-ending ethics violation. And when we're done with that investigation, let's take a look at the suspicious activities of some of the right-wing groups devoted to defeating Hillary in 2016 that seem to be awfully in sync with Gowdy's committee. We still don't know the details of the committee's interactions with these partisan Republican groups that were hyping this scandal in their own communications, but there are some tantalizing clues. The chairman of the Benghazi Action Committee, for example, referred to his group as, quote, an asset of the committee's. In September 2014, a group called Stop Hillary PAC delivered more than 260,000 signatures to the committee demanding that Gowdy subpoena Hillary to testify. The next day, Gowdy began the process to do just that. Then the PAC emailed its list soliciting campaign funds to support Trey Gowdy. Sounds like the sort of thing the Federal Elections Commission might be interested in. Then in April 2015, Stop Hillary PAC ran ads soliciting contributions using Gowdy's name and picture and identifying him as chairman of the Benghazi Committee. A month later, the group delivered another petition to Gowdy to express our gratitude and support. As the Washington Post reported, that PAC's treasurer, Dan Backer, previously served as the treasurer of a now-defunct fundraising committee affiliated with Gowdy. He is also treasurer of 3 other political action committees that each donated to Gowdy's campaign in May. Last Friday, Gowdy, caught red-handed, returned those donations. And why stop there? The misuse of taxpayer dollars doesn't just violate House ethics rules, it may violate federal law. In 1993, a former House employee pled guilty to a charge of theft of government property after he was caught doing campaign work on the taxpayer's dime. And I can't imagine the damage to taxpayers then was even close to $4.6 million. Trey Gowdy may be the Ken Starr of his generation, but even that may be too generous an assessment of his legacy. 60 years ago, there was another Republican legislator who turned an oversight investigation into a nightmarish political travesty, trampling on constitutional rights and engaging in repeated and serious abuses of power in a quest to destroy perceived enemies. When the extent of his malfeasance was exposed, he was censured by the Senate, shunned by his own party, and sent to live out the rest of his days in infamy. Joseph McCarthy managed to find a communist or two. All Gowdy has done is besmirch the memory of 4 dead Americans while betraying the public trust. Gowdy deserves to sit down to a banquet of consequences. Our country simply cannot function if this is how one of two major political parties chooses to compete for power. 60 years after McCarthy disgraced the Senate, we remember him as an ugly example of congressional power run amok for partisan gain, never to be repeated again. Let's hope it doesn't take 60 years for Trey Gowdy and the rest of the Benghazi hoaxsters to meet the same fate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As you know, our organization is nonpartisan,
Yes.
takes no positions on either policy questions or candidates. So I'm going to do a little bit of playing devil's advocate to bring out a few points about the book. So if one were to summarize the thesis of the book in perhaps a crude way, but I think not an unfair way, I would say that your essential points are that the modern conservative movement and the GOP are devoid of constructive policy ideas, devoid of ideas on which they could compete and win elections. And as a result, the politics of personal destruction has replaced a competition for ideas. So my question is, couldn't one argue fairly that your book itself is not an offering of a constructive, progressive vision, but rather, essentially, name-calling against the other side? Is there not some equivalence in what you're doing in the book to what you are complaining about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. I think that this book isn't designed to lay out a progressive vision at all. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to describe the Republican playbook for the next election cycle. And so the book, in my mind, the book is descriptive of their strategies, their tactics, their goals. You know, I mentioned in the talk that I was once involved in the conservative movement back in the 1990s. And what's different today, one of the things that's different today about how watching the movement operate is that back then, the goals of getting Bill Clinton impeached and thrown out of office, that was secret for years until I started to blow the whistle on it. Now, everything that I'm describing in this book pretty much is being done out in the open. It's much better financed, it's much more sophisticated, and even though the Koch brothers do try to hide some of what they're doing, it's right there for anyone to observe, and what I've tried to do is draw that together, based partly on my own experience in the conservative movement, and partly based on 12 years of tracking and monitoring and analyzing what's going on. I do agree with the part of your description that I think that what is behind these character attacks is an absence of an appealing agenda that the Republicans could put forward to the electorate. And, you know, I started writing this a year ago. I mean, this is playing out right now in the Republican primaries. I mean, it is very clear, I think, that no matter who wins this primary, the platform is the same. It's more tax cuts for the 1%, take away your health care, take away your Social Security, start another war, and build a wall. The only difference is Donald Trump says the wall will be beautiful, but that's basically what we're faced with. And so I think Hillary has a much stronger hand programmatically, policy-wise, and this is the choice they're making in terms of how they're going to conduct the election. And we'll see. We have another year to go. Maybe I'll end up being wrong and we'll get a really substantive debate, but I doubt it.
So Secretary Clinton has said that her use of the personal email account was a mistake. And polling indicates that it has caused questions, or perhaps exacerbated questions, in the public mind about her trustworthiness. How do you see your role and the role of your groups in coming to her defense, even on a matter that in fact she's admitted she may have done the wrong thing?
Sure. Well, so one of the group's Media Matters is dealing with flawed, false, wrong press coverage. And one of the things that happened which I mentioned in the talk, is that it's one thing for Hillary to have said, I made a mistake in the choice of just having the one account. It's another for the gold standard in American journalism, the New York Times, to 3 times in the last few months put the name Hillary Clinton and charges of possible criminal misconduct on the front page. All those stories were wrong, unraveled, retracted, but the problem is, to get to your question, is that people are taken in by misleading headlines. Not everybody has the time to follow every iteration of the story as it unravels. You don't always see the retractions. So a certain kind of damage is already done with the first false story. And so Media Matters, in terms of defending Hillary Clinton, is on watch for those stories. The first one, the very first story that reported that she had used the personal email account, said in the subheadline that this was a violation of federal rules. It was our job to figure out what rules actually applied. It turned out that the law that the Times was referring to was passed after she left office, so it did not apply. So she clearly did not break it. And we try to bring those facts to light. We put them on our website, MediaMatters.org. People use our facts then to contact the media directly. In this case, people were emailing and calling the Times, and the Times has an ombudsman. They call a public editor. And in the last few months, you don't have to take my word for it. The public editor has said that their coverage is troubling, flawed, unfair, and in an August column, basically had to extract out of the executive editor of the paper a pledge to be fair going forward to our coverage. So that's Media Matters. Correct the Record is a separate organization, and it's dealing with more political attacks. I think I pretty much did the political attacks justice in the talk, but that's the kind of work we're doing. When Trey Gowdy makes this accusation about the notion that she somehow had forwarded classified email, we are working round the clock in rapid response fashion to try to figure out what actually happened, and then to put everybody, the press and the public, on notice as to what that is, and try to take what they're presenting as a scandal and show it to be what it actually is, which in this case was just a total ruse.
So in your book, I want to go a little bit to essentially your case for Secretary Clinton as president. In your book, you assert, I would say, as if it were self-evident, that it's sexist to describe Secretary Clinton as being substantially in her current position because of who she married. But I guess I want to go to the idea that it is arguably simply a fact, right, that when you compare Secretary Clinton's history and resume to that of other women who have come to head countries, Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, Golda Meir, others, that it's a different trajectory, and that hers is, in fact, inexorably intertwined with Bill Clinton. So this goes to the question of whether or not some of the things at least that you're criticizing as unfair, in fact, your response may be unfair.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think people can decide that for themselves, but it was said that the reason Hillary is where she is because of who she married. And all I can tell you is that, I wrote a book about Hillary Clinton 20 years ago when I was still in the conservative movement. And the conclusion I made, and even at that time, obviously not ideologically in agreement with her, was that she had the kind of talent and the qualities that could make her a more significant figure historically than her husband. This was 20 years ago. I wasn't running anybody's presidential campaign. But those were the traits that I observed even as a skeptic. So I think she would be, yes, she followed a specific trajectory, but I think that there's no reason why she has, that it has to be said that that is how she got here, as if to imply that she's somehow not as talented as she actually is. And on the sexism, I just find that that the conversation about Hillary is replete with double standards. And I don't think they're always sexist, but I think often that's what's underneath it. And a lot of times, people don't even realize it. It's subliminal. It's something that there's a piece in the New Yorker a couple weeks ago that talked about the challenges of women candidates running for office. And the fact is that culturally, we're not used to somebody seeking that office. Only Hillary did it last time, and she wasn't the nominee. And so there's a lot of ways in which people think and express themselves that they're not used to it yet, and it can have a sexist taint to it, I think. Yeah.
You talked in your remarks about if Secretary Clinton's elected, that you believe she would pursue a kind of expansive, progressive agenda for the country. So I guess I want to explore a little bit Anderson Cooper's first question in the debate to Secretary Clinton and her response. She did give a speech recently in which she referred to herself as a moderate. And in the debate, she said she was a progressive who wants to get things done. So the hallmark of the Bill Clinton presidency, and even the years that ran up to it, was the work with the Democratic Leadership Council and the effort to redefine the Democratic Party away from the McGovern wing, which today would be the Sanders or the Warren wing, I suppose, and to redefine it as a more sort of centrist party.
Yes.
So, in your view, is Secretary Clinton representing a political position on the spectrum that's really fundamentally different than that of her husband in the 90s?
I think it is somewhat different. I wouldn't say fundamentally different, but times change, and it's 20 years later, and the problems that the country faces are different. What I reject is the notion that that is held by some of her critics, both on the right and the left, that she's a Johnny-come-lately to these progressive ideals, values, and policies and programs. Because if you look at the issue of income inequality, and you look at her Senate record, and everything from the minimum wage to pay equity, she was there. When you talk about reining in Wall Street, she gave speeches in 2007 about getting rid of the carried interest deduction, about greater regulation of the derivatives market. So I think on a lot of these issues, she was, before Elizabeth Warren was Elizabeth Warren, she was there. Now, I can't say it any better than the distinction she drew when she said that she's a progressive and a progressive who likes to get things done. And so the moderation, and I'm not inside her head, but the way I interpret that is a kind of realism. She's giving specific answers and specific programs to specific problems that are achievable. And that's what I think people appreciate about Hillary Clinton. It's not just what she stands for, but the ability to get the job done. Yeah, times have changed, but she was, the history of it shows, let's just take free trade. This was not some recent flip-flop on this free trade deal. She was always somewhat more skeptical than Bill Clinton about these free trade deals when she was in the Senate about NAFTA. So I think, as she said, nobody never changes a position, but I see a lot more consistency than what the critics see.
We are, of course, the World Affairs Council, so I want to talk a little bit about foreign policy. You discuss in the book the question of whether or not Secretary Clinton is a hawk.
Right.
I wonder if you could, if you could expand on that for the audience that hasn't had a chance to read the book yet. In particular, where you think she stands on the issue of Syria. The humanitarian toll in Syria is far worse than that that existed in the Balkans or in Haiti when Bill Clinton intervened in those cases militarily.
Right.
We've all heard President Clinton say that the worst mistake of his presidency was not intervening in Rwanda. So where do you think Secretary Clinton would come down if she were in the Oval Office on this terrible humanitarian tragedy in Syria?
Mm-hmm. So I think that, you know, I tried to get away from hawk and dove, but tried to describe a couple different things. One, I do think the record shows in some of the places where she has diverged from this administration's foreign policy positions lately, and in her book when she wrote about some of these issues, she, not reflexively, but she is more open to a more interventionist kind of solution. I think that's fair to say. You know, she considers her hallmark having put in place the combination of hard power military and soft power diplomacy. And so I think she's got a range of tools that she would see there, but I think you would expect a more openness to more engagement than you currently have, and probably than we had under President Clinton as well.
Last question from me, and then we'll open to the audience. It's been written that the Republican that the Clinton campaign least wants to run against is Marco Rubio, and that in particular, that's because of the age difference. And the idea that we've had several baby boomer presidents,
right.
And Marco Rubio comes from a later generation. Do you think it's accurate that he's the candidate most, or least desired, so to speak? And do you think that he would pose a fundamental challenge?
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily right. First of all, I think it's dangerous and can backfire to try to predict, well, I'd like to run against this one. I would hate to run against this one. This one's weak. It could turn out to be strong. This field is in flux. I think it's fair to say that 6 months, 8 months ago, there was a consensus that Jeb Bush was the most formidable, electable candidate that the Republicans could put forward. And that looks like that is not coming to fruition, that he is having trouble. He's low in the polls, and it looks like it may not be the standard bearer. So if you take him out and of the equation, and you're left with the rest, you know, I don't think there's necessarily, I think there are pluses and minuses with each of them. Clearly, Rubio would have a generational argument to make. I really think that the important factor with Rubio is the same with Jeb, which is Florida. Electoral math-wise, the Republicans need to carry Florida really to get to 270. And so you've got an edge if you're going to bring Florida with you. Jeb seemed like he probably would have. I don't know that Rubio beats Hillary in Florida. I'm not certain of that. But he would have that Florida credential. I really don't think age is something that's going to be used against Hillary Clinton. I mean, Karl Rove tried that. It turned out to be a very bad idea. So it's hard to say. If it comes down to, you know, an establishment figure versus an insurgent in the Republican primaries, the tendency would say, well, give us the more extreme one. But you know, it is so hard to predict. Nobody a year ago could have predicted where we'd be right now, and there are Republicans now saying more and more that they are trying to accept the possibility and wrap their heads around the notion that Trump actually could end up as the nominee. And I don't know if we Democrats have even thought about what kind of challenge that would present, because everybody's been waiting for him to collapse, and he seems to have staying power.
Thank you. I'd like to go to questions from the audience. We have a microphone that we're going to pass so that everybody can be heard. Who's got a question? Somebody over here. Sorry for the logistics, but.
I guess. Hello? Yes?
We can hear.
Okay, great, thanks. A question would be about the Republican House at this particular point in time. And so are there any, assuming that in a democracy we need two strong parties, not one off the rails, so to speak, and the inability for Boehner to have a successor and now all of this, are there any Republicans kind of in the wings who are able to talk against the Freedom Caucus or against the Trout-Gowdies and gain some sway within their party?
Yeah, it doesn't seem likely. There are a handful of more moderate, reasonable Republicans still in Congress. But I read something yesterday where there was some talk that they were so frustrated they might just not run for re-election. They don't really have the kind of voice that the 40 or 50 or however you count them in the hard right caucus has. And I think that it's pretty clear that nobody's going to get that speakership without the support of that group. So I know that there's Democrats would like to think that there are some Republicans who you can do business with, and it's a nice thought. But in this environment, I mean, look at what happened with President Obama on the night he was inaugurated. The Republicans were making a private pact to obstruct everything he wanted to achieve. That's the same party we're dealing with now, although it continually moves to the right. In 2008, you could say reasonable things about climate change and be a member of Republican Congress. You can't do that today. So it just continues to move further and further right. And so the question becomes, I think, if they lose the next presidential election, they will hold on to the House regardless, I think. But the party could well split at that point because I just don't know how much. I don't know how much further right they can go. And frankly, to go back to Donald Trump, that wasn't the question. But I mean, I don't see how anybody thinks a winning strategy could be, hurling vile insults at more than half the country. But this is what seems to be playing in the Republican base, and that's what's holding up. That's what's holding up the House too. The Freedom Caucus constituents are loving this, and there's an anti-establishment fervor in the grassroots of the conservative movement in the Republican Party, and that's what is causing the dysfunction in the House. And that's what's causing this kind of strange insurgent candidate thing going on in the Republican presidential primary too.
My question concerns gerrymandering. Is it your belief that as a result of gerrymandering that has occurred thus far, that the Democrats will not be able to get control of the House for a long period of time?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's definitely some election cycles away. The Republicans had a 10-year plan to take over governorships and state houses, and part of that agenda was to get control over the redistricting process, which they did in 2010. That was a watershed election, and that was a setback for Democrats for quite some time. And I think it's 2020 before you get another crack at redrawing some of those lines, but I think a lot of the damage is already done. And so even if the Republicans nominate at the top of the ticket somebody who doesn't do that well, it's really still hard to see. These districts are so, the way they're so chopped up, it's really hard to see, even with strong Democratic coattails, how you get the House back next cycle.
Do you see any real threats to Hillary gaining the Democratic primary?
Any real threats to her winning the Democratic primary?
Correct.
No, I don't think so. I think that I think the Sanders challenge will end up being a good thing in that he is inspiring a lot of Democrats. He's resonating on some of the issues that he's focused on, particularly with young people who may not, maybe they wouldn't have tuned into last week's debate if they weren't there to see him, but then they're also seeing Hillary. And I think there'll be a way to harness and marshal that excitement and support for her as the ultimate nominee. But yeah, no, I think there's not, I don't have any doubt that she'll be the nominee of the Democratic Party.
It seems to me that the damage to a certain degree from the Republicans as far as Hillary Clinton's trustworthiness, the polls are down regarding that. So I don't know how she gets out of that quagmire, really. I don't know what the strategy is on her side from the campaign, but it has seemed to really pull down her numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, there's a discernible impact of everything I've been describing up here on her poll numbers. But I feel that I feel like that the campaign and events are conspiring to turn a page in a good way for a number of reasons. One, after the summer, Hillary started to go out and answer questions in a variety of settings, from Sunday shows to town halls on the Today Show to Saturday Night Live. The more people see of her, I feel like the less they're going to be mistrusting. Two, all the comments that the Republicans have made about this investigation that I think discredit the whole thing it also is a way of starting to turn the page. One of the problems that she has had is that we did a study that showed, we coded a month of New York Times stories recently, and 70% of all Clinton stories were about the email, and 30% were about everything else. So as this email thing starts to clear away, the problem has been that the 30% can't break through all the clutter of the email. And the 30% is what she's campaigning on, which are the issues that people care about. So to be able to break through that, this has to pass. So tomorrow is part of turning the page. I think the more that people see of these emails, we've now seen thousands and thousands of emails. What's in them? That she wants skim milk in her tea and she tells an aide to pack warm socks on a trip. I mean, they are completely benign. And so the idea that there was some conspiracy when she first came into office as Secretary of State to hide something, it seems less and less plausible the more people see what's actually in the email. So I think a page is turning, and that's how, and I think you'll see it in the polls. You're starting to see, she got a bump out of the debate. The performance was, very, very highly rated across the board, even by people who oppose her. And so, but polls are going to fluctuate. Let's remember that at this time in 2011, you would have had, if the polls were determining the outcome of the election, you would have had President Michelle Bachmann, you would have had President Rick Perry, President Herman Cain. So it's still early, and there's plenty of time for those numbers to recover.
This will be the last one here.
What is your take on Ryan's announcement that he will take over Boehner's role, providing certain conditions? Do you think he can pull any weight in bringing the Republicans to their senses?
I doubt it. I think that anybody who takes that position is going to have the same challenge that John Boehner had. And it's pretty clear to me that it's the 40 extreme Republicans who are actually running the show. His position is he's not going to fight for it or have to campaign for it. They're going to have to assent to it. And we'll see if that's what actually happens. But if they do, then that tells you something too. And so I think it's a very tough job holding that whole caucus together. And that's why nobody wants the job, and that's why he's having his arm twisted to take it, because it's a pretty thankless job in the way that the current makeup is of the Republicans in the House. And then you've got people like Ted Cruz in the Senate, and it makes the idea of governing very, very tough.
Mike, can I ask one more?
Go ahead.
It's a quickie. On a personal nature, what made you take the change over?
Now, see, that's not a quick question. I can keep you here for another hour on that.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. Is something that...
Yes. So let's see if I can do this quickly. I wrote my first book back in the early 1990s about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. And it was a defense of Thomas after the hearings were over. And I was in the heart of the conservative world at the Heritage Foundation and the Washington Times. And this is what I thought. And I thought this was a factual presentation. What happened was I was sold a bill of goods at a relatively young age. And I found out that the people who were telling me one thing about Clarence Thomas, once I became part of the club, started to tell me things like they knew he did it all along, they didn't believe their own friend, this was just a partisan game. And, I was perhaps a bit naive at the time, and it really shook me. And having been sold a bill of goods and then seeing that the way lying was tolerated in that world and that culture, I started to really think twice about what it was going to end up doing to my own character if I stayed inside the conservative movement. And I started to feel more and more complicit the more I stayed inside. So in 1997, I first started to break with the conservative movement. And I'm glad I did, because if you look at the party today, there's no way I would have lasted all these years, So thanks for the question, though.
I see the hand of one of our high school students, so we'll go just a minute over to
Sure.
take that question, please.
This might be foolish, but what do you think of Kanye West running for president?
What do I think of? Yeah.
Kanye West 2020.
Oh, okay. Hey, look, I think one thing this cycle has shown is that more and more people from all sorts of walks of life are going to start running for president. Because you've got three who've been at the top of the Republican pack who have absolutely no government experience, so why not?
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.